Exodus 19:1 states that the nation of Israel arrived at Mount Sinai on the first day of the third month during the first year of the Exodus. This would have been just over 6 weeks since they had departed from the city of Ramses on April 23rd that year. So they arrived at Mount Sinai on June 7th in 1446 BC. Exodus 7:7 states that Moses was 80 years old at that time, and in order to communicate with God, he would be required to climb the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai is 2,285 meters, or roughly 7,497 feet high. Simply accomplishing that feat once at the age of 80 would be an accomplishment. But Moses would do this multiple times. Stay tuned to find out how many times, and what exactly occurred in the Wilderness of Sinai, only a month and a half after Israel left Egypt. Exodus 19:2 states, "When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain." So they made it to Sinai. The previous verse states that this occurred on the first day of the third month. The terminology Ha-Hodesh is used when speaking about the day in which they entered the wilderness of Sinai, and alludes to the first day of the month. They camped in front of the mountain, and it is in the next verse that the Bible records that Moses went up to God. It is assumed that Moses was called up to the mountain the day after their arrival at Mount Sinai due to the fact that the previous verse states that they had camped in front of the mountain. Upon reaching the summit, God proposes a covenant with Moses. Let's read Exodus 19 verses 5 through 6. "Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." There are 3 promises here that God makes to Israel if they will obey him and keep his covenant. They would become God's possession. The Hebrew word here is segulah and refers to a treasured possession. They would become a kingdom of priests, and they would become a holy people. And so Exodus 19:7 through 8 records that Moses went down to the mountain to relay the message to the elders of the people, and the people agree, saying, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." This all occurred on the second day of the third month. Due to the travel time up and down the mountain and Moses' age, we can safely assume that Moses didn't immediately go right back up a 7,000-foot tall mountain right after the people said yes. However, the while consecutive form of the verb is used in the scripture when stating that Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So we know these are consecutive events. We can assume then that on the next day, the third of the third month, Moses climbed up the mountain again to provide God the people's answer to his proposal. God's next instructions can be found in verses 10 through 13 of Exodus chapter 19. God told the people to consecrate themselves, to wash their garments, and he warned Moses that no man or beast was to approach the mountain or they would die. Here the Bible uses inclusive counting as with Christ's resurrection. Today, tomorrow, and the next day are 3 days. So the third day of the third month is the first day, and the 5th day of the third month is the last day of consecration. Exodus 19:14 records that Moses went back down the mountain to give the instructions to the people regarding consecration, and told the people to go as far as not going near a woman, meaning sexually, to ensure cleanliness. The 3 days passed, and Exodus 19:16 through 20 states, "So it came about on the third day when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up." This had to have been a terrifying sight for the people of Israel. Yes, they had seen his power through the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. Yes, they had awoke every morning since the wilderness of sin to find manna waiting to be gathered from the desert floor. But again, God displayed his power for them. He wanted them to understand that he was indeed a God to be feared and respected, because he was about to provide them with his law. First, however, in order to drive the point home, he called Moses up the mountain, and Moses went up. This time, God told Moses to go right back down the mountain and warn the people not to approach and break through to gaze upon the Lord as he descended atop the mountain. Moses reminds God that he already warned them about this, and that there was no need to tell them the same thing again. Obviously, Moses didn't want to waste a trip up the mountain to simply tell Israel something he had already told them. But God instructs Moses to warn the people again. The Hebrew word for warn here is ud, and refers to the act of affirming solemnly, or to admonish. The reason was simply out of love. No parent finds joy in disciplining their child, but it must be done. The God that we serve is a just God, and as a just and lawful God, he cannot abide evil in his presence. God had not yet taught Israel how to cleanse their sins through sacrifice, but he was expressing to them that the wages of sin was death, and in his presence no man could survive. This is why the blood of Christ is such a blessing to the believer today. Those of us saved by Jesus can boldly approach the throne of God, having been cleansed through his death and resurrection. But Israel did not yet have that blessing, so God wanted to ensure that they knew not to approach him. So Moses descends the mountain a third time on the 5th of the 3rd month to again remind Israel that they are not to approach the mountain, lest they bring God's judgment upon themselves. Exodus chapter 20 continues the events at Mount Sinai, and remember the while consecutive form of the Hebrew verbs is being used, so these are consecutive events. The next day, on the 6th of the 3rd month, 50 days after Passover, or Friday, June 12th, 1446 BC, God provided Israel with his 10 commandments. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, and on the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male and your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. The voice of God speaking his commandments terrified the nation of Israel. Through the speaking of these commandments, they realized, all of them, that they had already broken them, and that had to be terrifying. So the people entreated Moses to speak to God on their behalf, so that he would not kill them. Moses then climbed the mountain a 4th time. It was there that God spoke his law directly to Moses. It is recorded in Exodus 20, verse 22, through chapter 23, verse 33. Moses then returned to Israel and recounted God's law to them. They responded that they would obey all the words that God had spoken to Moses, and Moses then wrote the law onto parchment that would later be called the Book of the Covenant. The Bible goes on to say that early the next morning, on the 7th day of the 3rd month, that Moses erected 12 stone pillars, one for each tribe of Israel. Israel offered a sacrifice to God, and then God laid a foundation on which he would build the Christian faith. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and said, behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you, in accordance with all these words. The covenant which God made with Israel was made with blood. And if you recall, this has been a common theme with God. Death and sacrifice is always associated with his covenants. The blood of the sacrifice is important because God explains in Leviticus 17:11 that life is contained in the blood. Blood was spilled in the garden when God made garments of skin for Adam and Eve. The covenant of the bow made with Noah was made after Noah had offered a post-flood sacrifice. The covenant of the torch was made after Abraham split sacrifices into 2 pieces that the torch would later pass between. And now, as God enters into the Sinaitic covenant with the nation of Israel, he continues this theme and reintroduces the idea that blood is what seals this covenant. Blood is used because it contains life, and thus keeping the covenant leads to life, and not keeping it leads to death. We discussed this in our study God's administration through his covenants. Paul expounds on this principle in his letter to the Hebrews. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you. According to the law, one may almost say all things are cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Paul uses this line of thought to explain the significance of the sacrifice of Christ. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more with the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serving the living God. And thus the covenant was ratified. Moses would climb the mountain 4 more times for a total of 8 times. But I've already run out of time for this video. We'll pick up again next time to cover what happened after the covenant was ratified, and why not only 1, but 2 sets of stone tablets had to be made with the 10 Commandments etched on them. Until then, this is Deacon saying thanks for watching, and God bless.